Let me begin by asking you a very simple but powerful question. How many times must history repeat itself before we finally learn its lesson? We sit here today confronted with yet another crisis, another headline, another dramatic confrontation, this time between the United States of America and Venezuela. The words troops and missiles ready are being echoed across newsrooms and government briefings, and the tension in the air feels almost electric. But beneath the drama of military posturing lies a deeper story, a story of economics, of power, and of who truly pays the price when nations collide. When we hear the phrase troops and missiles ready, the immediate image that comes to mind is one of imminent war, of danger, of nations preparing for an unavoidable clash. But I want you to pause for a moment and ask a very simple question. Does Venezuela truly pose a military threat to the United States? Does a country in South America with limited military reach and no history of attempting aggression against Washington suddenly threaten the world's largest and most powerful military? Or is there something deeper here, something carefully hidden beneath the headlines? Because the truth, if we are willing to look at it, is that this confrontation has almost nothing to do with security and almost everything to do with oil and economics. Consider the facts. Venezuela holds the largest proven oil reserves in the world, not Saudi Arabia, not Iraq, not Russia, Venezuela. A nation sitting on a treasure chest of black gold, and a nation that, for decades, U.S. corporations had access to, until Venezuelan leaders decided that those resources would be used primarily for Venezuelans, not for ExxonMobil, not for Chevron, not for Wall Street. And here's the hook: every time in history a resource-rich nation has chosen independence over obedience, confrontation with Washington has followed. That is not a coincidence, it is a pattern. So, when we see missiles moved into position and troops deployed near Venezuela, we must resist the temptation to believe the official story, because the official story is always dressed up in noble language: protecting democracy, defending freedom, ensuring stability. But the real story, the story that does not make it to the evening news, is about wealth and who controls it. Oil is not just another commodity. It is the blood of the modern economy. Whoever controls it controls markets, controls currency stability, and controls global influence. And Venezuela, by asserting its right to manage its oil on its own terms, suddenly became an enemy, not because of what it did militarily, but because of what it did economically. Now think about this hook. If Venezuela had no oil, would the United States care enough to mobilize troops and missiles? Would Washington issue endless statements about instability and threats? Or would Venezuela simply be another struggling country ignored by the global superpowers? The answer is obvious. The obsession with Venezuela has nothing to do with ideology or values. It has everything to do with barrels of oil. And because oil fuels profits, industries, and currencies, that oil becomes a matter of life and death for the economic elites who shape U.S. foreign policy. It is important to underline that this is not a new phenomenon. The same logic drove U.S. involvement in the Middle East for decades. The same logic shaped interventions in Latin America throughout the 20th century. The same logic explains why some dictatorships are condemned while others are quietly supported. It has nothing to do with their treatment of citizens and everything to do with whether they align with the economic interests of the United States. Venezuela is simply the latest example of this unbroken chain. And here is where the real danger lies. The language of national security is being weaponized to conceal an economic agenda. The American public is told that missiles must be readied because Venezuela is a threat. But the only real threat Venezuela poses is the threat of independence. The threat of showing the world that a nation with resources can choose to use them for its people rather than for global corporations. That example, if successful, could inspire others. And for Washington, that is more dangerous than any missile Venezuela could ever build. So when you hear troops and missiles ready, I urge you to hear it differently. Hear it as profits and markets protected. Hear it as foil and resources secured, because that is what lies beneath the headlines, and that is the reality that shapes the choices being made. The hook we must hold on to is simple. This is not about protecting Americans from danger. It is about protecting corporations from competition. And until we recognize that, we will continue to be fooled into supporting confrontations that have nothing to do with our safety and everything to do with someone else's wealth. When the headlines scream, troops on alert and missiles positioned, the first instinct of many is to assume that some great danger is at hand. The visuals are powerful: military equipment rolling across landscapes, jets soaring through the sky, soldiers in formation. It projects strength, urgency, and inevitability. But here is the uncomfortable truth we must confront more often than not. These displays of military power are less about protecting people and more about protecting profits. The real story hidden behind the theater of troops and missiles is an economic one. Think about the pattern. When America moves its military close to a country like Venezuela, it is not because that country has the capacity to launch a devastating attack on the United States. Venezuela does not have that kind of military power. What it does have is something arguably more dangerous to the interests of U.S. corporations and policymakers: an economy that resists their dominance. And here's the hook: when economics clash, the first tool of intimidation is not always negotiation, it is military posturing. Tanks, missiles, and fleets become symbols of pressure. They say, without words, do as we want or face consequences. This tactic has been used for generations. In the Cold War, U.S. military presence around the world was justified as defense against communism. In practice, much of it was about ensuring markets remained open to American capital and that resources were directed toward Western companies. The language was about freedom. The reality was about economics. Fast forward to today, and the same mask is being worn, just with a different target. Venezuela, with its oil and its refusal to yield to Washington's demands, is painted as a security risk. Yet the risk is not to the American homeland, it is to the profits of corporations and the influence of U.S. economic policy. Ask yourself this: why is the United States, with the largest and most advanced military in the world, so concerned with a country that has a fraction of its power? Why are missiles and troops necessary against a nation that has neither the capacity nor the desire to attack Washington? The answer is that military movements are not always about direct threats. They are about shaping global markets, controlling narratives, and sending signals not just to the targeted nation, but to the entire world: defy us, and this is what you face. That is the unspoken message every missile deployment carries. And here's another hook worth remembering: the costs of this theater are staggering. Every aircraft carrier positioned near Venezuela, every missile transported to a launch site represents billions of dollars. But who pays for it? Not the corporations whose interests are being protected. It is the American taxpayer. The very citizens who are told this is about their safety are the ones financing a performance designed to protect economic elites. And while billions are poured into flexing military muscle, schools close, hospitals struggle, and infrastructure crumbles. The trade-off is clear. It is just rarely spoken about, Venezuela in this moment becomes more than a country. It becomes a stage upon which the United States demonstrates to the world that its military is ready to defend not just borders, but business. And that is the true face of military posturing. It is economic enforcement in uniform. It is a signal that markets are guarded by missiles, that corporate profits are defended by troops. The language of freedom and democracy is there to soften the reality, to make the performance palatable to the public, but the core of it remains economic interest. So when you watch the footage of troops lined up and missiles being prepared, do not simply see defense, see leverage, see intimidation, see the machinery of economics disguised as the machinery of war. And the hook that should stay with us is this: whenever the military is mobilized without a clear and present danger to the American people, you must ask whose interests are being protected, because more often than not, it is not yours, it is not mine, it is theirs. We are told again and again that Venezuela is unstable, that its economy has collapsed, that its people are suffering, and those claims are not entirely false. Life in Venezuela is difficult, and the economic situation has been devastating for millions. But here is the critical question that is almost never asked in mainstream discussions. Why is Venezuela unstable? Is this collapse purely the result of government mismanagement, or is it the direct consequence of deliberate economic warfare waged against the country? The answer, when you examine the evidence, is undeniable. The instability that Washington condemns is, in large part, the instability Washington itself has engineered. Let us break this down. For years, the United States has imposed harsh economic sanctions on Venezuela. These are not minor inconveniences. These sanctions cut Venezuela off from international financial systems, restrict its ability to trade, freeze its assets abroad, and block access to vital goods such as medicine, machinery, and even food. And here's the hook: when you strangle an economy, when you deliberately limit a nation's ability to function in global markets, what do you think happens? The economy collapses, the currency plummets, shortages emerge, and then the very government responsible for imposing those sanctions points at the chaos and says, look, Venezuela is failing. This is a vicious cycle. First, sanctions destabilize the economy. Then that instability is used as proof that the Venezuelan government is incompetent or dangerous. Finally, the instability is offered as justification for further sanctions, deeper isolation, and even military threats. It is like setting a house on fire and then blaming the homeowners for not keeping their families safe. That is the political theater we are witnessing today. The reality is that sanctions are a weapon, an economic missile. They do not explode like bombs, but their impact can be just as deadly. Hospitals that cannot access medicines, families who cannot afford food, entire industries brought to a halt. All of these are consequences of sanctions. And here's the painful irony: while Washington frames sanctions as pressure on the government, it is ordinary Venezuelans who pay the highest price. The elites may feel the squeeze, but it is the working class that bears the suffering. Now consider this hook: if Venezuela were truly failing solely because of its government, why would the United States need to impose sanctions at all? Why not simply let the Venezuelan system collapse under its own weight? The reason is simple: Venezuela's economy would not collapse on its own. Despite corruption, despite mismanagement, Venezuela's oil wealth and natural resources gave it a foundation for survival. It is the sanctions, the deliberate blocking of that wealth from reaching its people, that transformed economic challenges into humanitarian crises. That is why sanctions exist, not to protect democracy, but to create the very instability that can then justify intervention. This is not new. We have seen the same strategy used in Cuba, Iran, and Iraq before the 2003 invasion. Sanctions are presented as a peaceful alternative to war, but in reality, they are an act of war, slow, grinding, and devastating. They achieve with starvation and scarcity what bombs achieve with explosions. They weaken societies, fracture economies, and pave the way for military confrontation under the guise of humanitarian concern. So the next time you hear a U.S. official declare that Venezuela is unstable, hold on to this hook. Instability is not a natural disaster. It is not a storm that blew in from nowhere. It is a policy choice. It was designed, implemented, and maintained by the very voices now calling Venezuela a threat. And if we fail to recognize that, we will continue to accept the false narrative that justifies aggression while ignoring the real story, economic warfare dressed up as moral concern. When we talk about troops and missiles, about sanctions and confrontations, the conversation often feels abstract, like strategy, like policy, like some kind of chessboard where nations move pieces against one another. But here is the truth that rarely makes it into the headlines. Behind every missile, every sanction, every troop deployment, there are ordinary people whose lives are turned upside down. And those people are not policymakers, not corporate executives, not presidents. They are workers, families, and communities who bear the brunt of decisions made far above their heads. Let's look at Venezuela first. The sanctions and military threats do not land on the desks of elites. They land in the kitchens of working families. Parents who once could put food on the table now struggle to afford basic groceries. Hospitals run short on essential medicines, not because the doctors lack knowledge, but because shipments are blocked. Children grow up under the weight of scarcity, their futures stunted by forces they cannot control. And here's the hook: the so-called pressure on the government is in practice pressure on the people. It is not the president who goes hungry, it is the population. It is not the oil minister who lacks medicine for his children, it is the working class. But let us not imagine that ordinary Americans are untouched. Every time the U.S. mobilizes its military, it is not CEOs who foot the bill, it is taxpayers. Every missile transported to a launch site, every carrier deployed to the Caribbean, every soldier stationed near Venezuela comes with a price tag in the billions. And those billions could have been used to fix roads, to improve schools, to expand healthcare. Instead, they are funneled into a performance of strength that protects corporate profits abroad while neglecting human needs at home. The hook here is painful but undeniable. While elites gain security for their investments, working Americans lose security in their own communities. And let's not forget the soldiers themselves, young men and women, many from working class backgrounds, are sent to the front lines of these confrontations. They are told they are defending democracy, but in reality, they are defending the economic interests of those who will never set foot on the battlefield. They risk their lives, they endure the trauma, while boardrooms in Washington and New York reap the benefits. Ordinary people pay not only in dollars, but in blood and in spirit. There is another dimension to this cost: global perception. When America postures with missiles, it feeds an image of aggression that alienates allies and inflames resentment abroad. That resentment does not harm the elite. It harms everyday Americans traveling, working, and building relationships across the world. They become the face of policies they never chose, paying the social cost of actions taken by those in power. And here's the hook we cannot ignore: the confrontation between America and Venezuela is not really a confrontation between two peoples. Ordinary Venezuelans do not wake up wanting to fight Americans. Ordinary Americans do not wake up wanting to fight Venezuelans. The confrontation is between a small group of powerful elites and a nation that dares to chart its own economic course. Yet both populations are dragged into the consequences through scarcity, through fear, through sacrifice. This is the cruel genius of how global power operates. The benefits are concentrated at the top, while the costs are distributed among the many. In Venezuela, the cost is hunger, shortages, and instability. In America, the cost is wasted resources, deferred dreams, and misplaced priorities. In both countries, the people lose while the corporations and political elites win. So, when you see the images of troops standing ready and missiles being rolled into place, don't be fooled into thinking this is about national pride or security. The hook to hold on to is clear. This is about ordinary people paying for decisions that enrich the few. And until we see that, until we demand that policies serve the people rather than exploit them, the cycle will continue. New enemies, new sanctions, new confrontations, and the same old story of ordinary lives sacrificed for someone else's gain. History has a way of repeating itself, especially when the lessons remain unlearned. When we look at today's confrontation between the United States and Venezuela, it might feel like something new, something unique to our time. But here's the hook: this is not new at all. This is a familiar pattern, one that stretches back decades. The playbook has been written, refined, and repeated, and Venezuela is simply the latest stage on which it unfolds. Go back to Iran, 1953. The elected government of Mohammad Mossadegh made the bold decision to nationalize Iranian oil, taking control away from British and American corporations. Almost overnight, he became an enemy of the West. The CIA orchestrated a coup, removed him from power, and reinstalled a dictator friendly to U.S. interests. The official story was about stopping communism. The real story was about protecting oil profits. Now fast forward to Venezuela, where a similar struggle over oil control defines the confrontation. Different country, different decade, same playbook. Moved to Chile, 1973. Salvador Allende, democratically elected, began implementing socialist reforms, raising wages, nationalizing key industries, redistributing land. Washington could not allow that example to succeed. Sanctions, covert operations, and finally a coup replaced Allende with General Pinochet, a dictator who rolled back reforms but opened the country to foreign capital. The justification: protecting freedom and stability. The result: economic obedience to U.S. interests at the expense of democracy. Does that sound familiar when you hear today's rhetoric about Venezuela being a failed state in need of saving? And the pattern doesn't stop there. In Central America during the 1980s, the United States supported armed groups and dictatorships to crush movements that sought independence from Washington's control. In Iraq, the narrative was weapons of mass destruction. In Libya, it was humanitarian intervention. Each time the hooks were the same: freedom, democracy, security. Each time the reality was also the same: resources, markets, and economic influence. Here is the painful truth: every time a nation asserts the right to manage its own economy in a way that challenges U.S. dominance, it finds itself in Washington's crosshairs, and the pattern is strikingly consistent. Step 1: label the government illegitimate, corrupt, or authoritarian. Step 2: impose sanctions and economic pressure to create internal chaos. Step 3: amplify that chaos as proof the government has failed. Step 4: justify intervention, military, covert, or diplomatic, as necessary to restore stability. The hook is clear: the process is not about helping the people of those nations. It is about disciplining them for daring to resist. Now consider Venezuela again. Its decision to use oil wealth for social programs, to maintain independence from U.S. corporations, and to align with alternative global powers like Russia and China. Those are the real offenses in Washington's eyes. That is why we hear the same recycled language of instability, dictatorship, and threats. The labels may change, the speeches may evolve, but the underlying strategy is the same one used in Iran, Chile, Iraq, and beyond. This repetition should force us to ask, how many times will Americans allow themselves to be persuaded by the same narrative? How many times can we be told that military action or sanctions are about freedom when history shows us again and again that it is about economics? The hook we must hold on to is this: if the justification for intervention sounds noble, but the outcome consistently enriches corporations and entrenches U.S. dominance, then the justification is a mask, not a motive. What makes this pattern so dangerous is that it is self-perpetuating. Every intervention creates resentment abroad, destabilizes regions, and plants the seeds for future conflicts. And then those future conflicts are used to justify new interventions. It is a cycle with no natural end unless people recognize it for what it is and demand something different. So when you hear that Venezuela is the next threat, the next crisis, the next justification for troops and missiles, remember Iran, remember Chile, remember Iraq. Remember the countless times the same story was told, the same words were used, and the same pattern unfolded, because history is not just something to read in books. It is happening again right in front of us. And the lesson, if we are willing to see it, is that the script has not changed, only the actors have. When missiles are rolled into position and troops are stationed on alert, it creates a powerful image, an image of strength, of readiness, of a nation determined to defend itself. But here's the hook: does this display actually make us safer, or does it create the illusion of security while hiding the fact that true safety, true stability comes not from missiles but from diplomacy, cooperation, and mutual respect? The uncomfortable truth is that the billions spent on weapons could be achieving far more if invested in peace, not war. Think about what security really means. Is it the presence of a missile on a launch pad, or is it the assurance that your family has health care when they are sick? Is it the ability to send a carrier fleet across the Caribbean, or is it the ability to ensure every child can attend a well-funded school? Security is not just about borders, it is about lives. And when nations choose military confrontation over diplomacy, they are not protecting people, they are sacrificing them on the altar of power. Consider Venezuela again. What danger does it actually pose to the American people? None. Its missiles are not pointed at Washington. Its troops are not preparing to cross U.S. borders. The only danger Venezuela presents is economic independence, the refusal to hand over its oil wealth to foreign corporations. So why answer that with military posturing? Why mobilize troops instead of negotiators? The hook here is simple: because diplomacy does not serve those who profit from instability. Diplomacy strengthens people. Missiles strengthen elites. History has already shown us the futility of relying on military solutions. Iraq was bombed in the name of democracy. Afghanistan was occupied in the name of security. Libya was attacked in the name of humanitarian intervention. And yet, are those regions safer today? Are Americans safer because of those wars? Or are we burdened with trillions in debt, thousands of lost lives, and a reputation as a global aggressor rather than a peacemaker? The record is clear: missiles cannot build peace. They only destroy it. Now imagine a different path. Imagine if the resources spent on deploying troops against Venezuela were instead invested in regional cooperation, trade agreements that respected sovereignty, humanitarian partnerships that alleviated suffering, and diplomatic dialogues that built trust instead of fear. Imagine if, instead of punishing Venezuela with sanctions that create hunger, Washington sat at the table and negotiated fair access to resources that benefited both nations. That is not weakness, that is wisdom, because lasting security is built not through intimidation, but through collaboration. And here's the hook we must hold on to. Every missile is not only a weapon, it is also a missed opportunity to build schools, to provide health care, to repair infrastructure, a missed opportunity to strengthen lives instead of threatening them. When we choose missiles over diplomacy, we are not just threatening another nation, we are robbing our own citizens of the security they deserve. True security does not come from pointing weapons at the world. It comes from building a world where weapons are no longer necessary. It comes from addressing the roots of conflict, inequality, exploitation, poverty, rather than amplifying them with threats and force. Missiles may silence an enemy for a time, but diplomacy builds a future where enemies can become partners. That is the kind of security no weapon can provide. So the next time we hear that missiles are being readied, we must ask, ready for what? Ready to destroy lives, ready to protect profits? Or are we ready finally to recognize that real safety requires cooperation, not confrontation? The answer to that question will determine not only the future of America and Venezuela, but the future of a world that desperately needs peace over power. And the hook that must guide us is simple: missiles can defend borders, but only diplomacy can defend humanity.